back, and this video is taking a little longer than I expected, so it's a couple days later. So how do we quantify the strength of these filters? Well, I thought this time I would try something new and just dive right into some of the math behind how people typically talk about the strength of filters. If you were paying attention to that plot we had of the harmonic series of the peaks in the frequency domain of the sawtooth wave, you may have noticed that as we moved along the x-axis, the peaks actually got closer together. And that's not because those harmonic peaks aren't spaced equally. They are. It's that that plot was actually logarithmic. So what does that mean? Well, typically when you plot something, the most common way to plot the x-axis is linearly. So what does that mean? Well, if this is 1, then these are spaced equally. Then typically this is 2, and this is 3, and this is 4, and so on. In a logarithmic plot, the x-axis is plotted exponentially. So in a base 10 logarithmic plot, what that means is that if this distance is 1, then this distance is actually 10, and then this distance is 100, and so on. So as you move along the graph, these distances actually become greater. And there are a couple of reasons why you'd want to do that. The first is that your graph can contain more information. So now we're able to contain all this information that would have otherwise been way off the plot in this smaller area. The second is that there's actually a physical reason for doing this, and that is that if you were to measure the power behind a sound wave, in terms of pressure, or the power of the signal, if I were to double the power of a signal, it turns out that you wouldn't perceive that signal as being twice as loud. You'd actually have to increase the power behind the sound wave exponentially in order for you to perceive it as being twice as loud. And so what that means in terms of the math is that typically when we're talking about the power of sound waves, we tend to measure it logarithmically. And the way we do that is by using decibels. So what is a decibel? Well, you may have heard somebody say, the sound level at the club was 130 decibels or something. I mean, that would be really loud, but 120 decibels. Decibels are a logarithmic measure of a ratio. So when you say something is 120 decibels, it always has to be in relation to something else. And the most common way you'll hear decibels used is you'll say it's 120 decibels relative to the quietest sound that you could possibly hear. When we're talking about filters, we're talking about the ratio of the output power of a signal at a given frequency to the input power of the signal. So I guess a little more concretely, this is the equation for decibels. So the equation is 10 times the base 10 log of the ratio of the output power to the input power. 10 base 10 log of output power to input power. And we can kind of just plug in some numbers here to see what we might actually mean by that. So let's say that you had a filter that didn't filter anything. It just passed all frequencies through equally. In that case, the output power would be equal to the input power. So this P over P0 is equal to 1. And as we know, the base 10 log, or actually the log of any base log of 1 is equal to 0. So we say 0 dB is no attenuation of the signal at all. Now let's look at what happens if we were to have the power of the signal. So P over P0 is equal to 1/2 or 0.5. In that case, we find that base 10 log of 0.5 is equal to negative 3.010. So this negative 3 dB level is a pretty important one when we're talking about signals, and it represents a halving of the output power. If you were to run this same math with a P over P0 of 2, meaning that we were to double the output power, so we were to amplify the signal, you'd find that this decibel, the decibel ratio would be 3 dB. So 3 dB represents a doubling, negative 3 dB represents a halving of the output power. And that is important for a number of reasons, but it's particularly important when we're talking about filters. So I've kind of plotted this out here. This is what a low-pass filter would look like in the real world. And this is a real filter. And you can see here the attenuation is 0 dB for low frequencies, and then it falls off as we move along towards higher frequencies. And it turns out that for real filters, the cutoff frequency is not the point at which this graph begins to fall off. It's actually the negative 3 dB level, so the point at which the output power of the signal is halved. Now remember, having the output power doesn't mean that you're going to perceive the signal as being half as loud. Because of the exponential nature of sound waves, it won't be perceived as being half as loud. It will be perceived as being, less loud, but not quite half as loud. So let's say that your cutoff frequency is here, all right, and this is the negative 3 dB level. Then there's actually kind of like this little space here. So the filter's falling off, but it's not attenuated to negative 3 dB yet. So now you're attenuating, but not quite at the cutoff frequency. Well, in order to compensate for that, that's what this parameter known as resonance is. And that's something that you can, that's one of the parameters of the autofilter. So what resonance is it adds this little blip over the cutoff frequency, and it sort of compensates for this fall off. If you get a really big resonance, then it starts to look kind of like this big peak here, and it gives your filter kind of a tinny quality to it. So what happens if you have a really big resonance? Well, now your low pass filter is starting to actually shift towards higher frequencies because you start to get these artifacts here. So in order to compensate for that, there's also another parameter, which is fatness. And so for a low pass filter, what the fatness is it kind of compensates for the tinniness of the filter, and it adds some extra space to the filter here for low frequencies. So fatness, resonance. And then the last parameter that you were able to modify with the autofilter was actually the slope of the filter. So basically the rise over run of this filter. Now remember, this graph is not plotted linearly. It's actually plotted exponentially. So this slope is not a straight line in a linear plot. It's a straight line in the exponential plot. And when we talk about the slope of this line, typically it'll be represented in terms of dB per decade. So this might be, say, in what's called a single pole filter. This would be a negative 6 dB per decade filter. And that represents the fall off in the low pass filter. When you say negative 6 dB per decade, that means that for every doubling of the frequency, we attenuate by negative 6 dB. So that's what the terminology there is. And in Logic, you can set that 4-pole filter to attenuate more aggressively or less aggressively. So it's how quickly does this filter fall off. All right, so that was a lot of information, a lot of math. If that didn't make perfect sense, then I think the key things to understand conceptually are fatness boosts low frequencies, resonance boosts frequencies near the cutoff, and then the slope of the filter determines how quickly things fall off after you get above the cutoff frequency in a low pass filter. So that's kind of the conceptual understanding, and let's dive back into Logic and see what that actually looks like in our amplitude plot. All right, so we are back in Logic, and I just wanted to dive into those three parameters that we just talked about. So those are the resonance, which you see here, and then the fatness, which we can control here, and then finally the slope, which we can control here. And in the auto filter, the slope only works for a low-pass filter. So yeah, let's just look at what those end up looking like when we plot them in the frequency domain. So first, let's take a look at resonance. So I mentioned resonance is a boosting of the frequencies near the cutoff frequency. So here is our filter, and it works, we already know about the cutoff. But what happens when we boost the resonance? You can actually hear some artifacts showing up there, but notice that now near the cutoff frequency we kind of have this new peak. Okay, so that might not have even been the best example. All right, and it gives it kind of that tinny quality, so you can see the peak there on the plot. Okay, next let's talk about the slope. So as I move through these different slopes, this is 6 dB per decade, 12 dB, 18, and then 24. So what this is going to do is it's going to increase the slope, or the rate at which the filter kind of attenuates as we move to higher frequencies. So let's get rid of the resonance. All right, so you can see here at a 6 dB per decade, that's the slowest rate, and we get more high frequency content. But then as I move to a 12 dB filter, it falls off more quickly. An 18 dB filter even more so, and a 24 dB filter is the steepest. So let's just go through those again. Okay, so that's the slope. And then finally, let's look at fatness. So fatness works along with resonance. If you have a high resonance, you might want to boost the low frequencies to compensate for the tinniness of the filter. So let's do something with more low frequency content. Okay, so here we've got a high resonance. Now we can boost the low frequencies. Right. But notice it doesn't really do anything for frequencies above the cutoff. It's mostly for frequencies below the cutoff. So you can see over here, it's boosting things, but not so much over here. All right, so that is resonance, slope, and fatness. All right, I think that's it for filters. Thanks for checking it out, and see you next time.